What's up, yellow little faith, and welcome to episode 47 of the Fagnostic Podcast. I'm your hostess, not your Moses, Matt Hayes, and today I've got a really unique guest, someone who is unlike anyone I've ever had on the show before. His name is Fabrice Houdart. He's a French human rights advocate, whistleblower, academic, and frankly, one of the most quietly consequential people working in LGBTQ plus rights today. He spent over a decade at the World Bank before leaving to join the United Nations, where he co-authored the UN Global LGBTI Standards of Conduct for Business, essentially writing the rulebook for how corporations should treat LGBTQ plus people worldwide. He's an adjunct professor. He's a founder of the Association of LGBTQ plus Corporate Directors and a Stonewall Rebel honoree. He also is a father through surrogacy and became one at a time when France didn't even recognize the citizenship of children born that way abroad. He fought that battle on 3 continents. He is brilliant, he is brave, and he has receipts. Fabrice Houdart, welcome to the Fagnostic Podcast. Fabrice, I'm so happy to have you here. I know we chatted briefly before we hit record, and I was able to dote on you for a little bit about the incredible relevance with which you operate as someone who updates me on all things politics and LGBTQ issues across the globe. I'm so thankful for your work. You exist in a space that is so foreign to me, being that you are East Coast based. You are international, and you have such a unique perspective on things that I really care about. So first and foremost, thank you for being here and talking to us and my audience. It's such an honor, and I can't wait for us to get into how you got to where you are as a writer, and also someone who operates the way that you operate within the corporate space. Also, I want to dig into, because that's not a world in which I know. So just thank you for being here.
Well, no. First of all, I have to tell you, I'm extremely sensitive to flattery and compliments, so you have to stop immediately. And second of all, I have been to the West Coast a few times. So, even though it's true that I think of myself as an East Coaster, I have a dream that one day, I'll make it to California and I'll end my days there.
Good to know. Well, you'll have to keep me posted, because I feel these days I do feel more of a Californian than an American. For obvious reasons. And I'm thankful to call this place home. It's the biggest gift to be able to live here in Southern California. So you'll have to keep me posted. And before we get going, can you just identify your pronouns for me so we know how to address?
Yeah, sure. My pronouns are he, him, and, perfect. Yeah. My pronouns are he, him.
Awesome. Sorry. And then can you, because I start every episode with this sticky question, but can you tell me what you believe in?
Yeah. I believe in God. That's funny that you asked that question, because, I have 2 children that are 13-year-old. They're actually Jewish, so they are going to have their bar mitzvah in a few weeks. And so I hear them. Yeah, I hear them preparing for the bar mitzvah, and so they are talking about God. But they know that I believe in God. And from time to time, because they're 13, we're starting to have discussion about what I believe in. So I love it. I believe in God. I don't really practice any religion. I was raised Catholic, and I don't really go to church, although I am very interested in spiritual things, and I'm very interested in what's happening also in the Vatican. And that's something I pay attention to a lot. And if you notice,
Sure.
Sometimes in my newsletter, I actually write a lot about developments that are related to how the Catholics have evolved, on the topic of homosexuality. Yes. So I would say I'm a lot Catholic, but I keep an eye on the church, so I'm not completely lapsed,
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way, not with Catholicism specifically, because I was raised Protestant Southern Baptist, but I keep my eyes on all things religion, because I just think it's never going anywhere, and I want to figure out how to tackle it so we can speak to those people who are still in those pews being told how to live a certain way when it's antithetical to their existence. You grew up in France, right?
Yeah, I grew up in France. I grew up in Paris, actually. I was born in La Muette, which is in the 16th in Paris. And I grew up in a pretty Catholic environment. I mean, my parents were not practicing, but I went to a Catholic school as an example. And I was a scout where religion, I was a Marine Scout, actually, and religion played a pretty big role. And as you can imagine, sometimes it conflicted a little bit with my sexual orientation.
Of course. So, and you just mentioned and I actually wanted to talk about parenthood, because it's one of the things I'm most passionate about, is helping people become parents through assisted reproduction. So I do a lot of work in the surrogacy space and egg donor. But at what point did you decide to become a dad? And then I also want to know, with you being raised Catholic, how did you decide to raise them in the Jewish faith?
It's funny because I love to say that I had children by accident, which people always think is weird for a straight guy, for a gay guy to say, But I met an Israeli when I was 30 years old. And, Israeli men tend to be very interested in parenting. Culturally, I think children is very important. In fact, I remember around that time, I used to go to Tel Aviv and I would see a lot of Israelis with children. And so my ex-boyfriend was very keen on having children. And so at some point, when I was 33, I think, he said, look, it doesn't look like you're making any effort to make that project progress. And I said a little bit impulsively, which is the way I operate. I said, well, let's have children. So we had children, and and then we split like shortly after, but I always say it's the best mistake I ever made.
Yeah.
And then because he was Israeli, you know, we we uh, we negotiated a few things, and one of the things was that he was very keen in having his children being Jewish, and I actually didn't mind because I like the Jewish religion, and this idea of
Yeah.
leaving the world a better place that really echoes with me a lot. And so I was actually pretty happy. In fact, I am sometimes, I have good relationship with him, and we raise the children together. And sometimes I reproach him that he doesn't take the kids to temple, and I wish he would
Uh-huh.
teach them a little more, on religion.
Oh, how interesting. Yeah, it's with all that's going on in the world today with Israel and the Jewish faith has always been so important to me. Growing up Southern Baptist, we didn't have a temple in my hometown. I didn't know a Jewish person until middle school. He was my band teacher and then he went somewhere else but I always felt like the Jewish faith was the answer to the questions I had about Christianity. And I felt like there was such a grace for being curious within the Jewish faith. I felt like there was also a similar othering that I saw with Jewish people as a young gay kid in the South. Not that we had the same plight in life in terms of our journey, but I felt very kindred in that I felt othered as a young gay kid in the South. And I know that Jewish people, according to Christians, were also othered. And so I always felt like the Jewish people were my people as well. To the point where actually I have Hebrew tattooed on my arm, which I know is not something that a lot of Jewish people would do. But the Jewish faith has always been so important to me. So I find it so interesting that that's how you and your former partner decided to raise your children. That's beautiful. And they're about to have their bar mitzvah, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because growing up gay, and I think that's a big part of the gay experience. I
Yeah.
I I had no connection to spirituality for a very long time, because I left, because I felt that odd with the Catholic Church, and it was very difficult. I had to little by little gradually come back to having a belief in God, and so that means I am not very anxious about whether my children have a faith, what type of faith they have. I kind of see it as
Hmm.
like a natural personal journey. And so I'm not super interested in trying to convince them of anything, right? And they kind of tell people that I go to church, but in a very matter of factual way. And I'm not trying very hard to get them to believe in anything.
Yeah, I think that's the best kind of parenting. It's so many kids are groomed to believe one certain way, and it's I think some of the most traumatizing acts you can perform as a parent is to inform your kids on what to think and how to believe before they have a chance to experience the world for themselves. How did
Yeah,
where
yeah,
how
but
I
I'm
want
kind of intense. I'm kind of intense about what they wear. Meaning, if we go for dinner, I always tell them that they cannot wear sneakers. So I guess I'm controlling in many other ways, but I'm not really controlling
Sure.
about faith and religion.
Yeah, good. Well, they're lucky for that. Because I want to get to your Substack because I can't tell you how important it is for me every week to get this news source from you because it gets me out of my bubble of West Coast news and even national news and gets me much more aware of what's going on in the world, which sometimes is really encouraging and sometimes is really discouraging. So how did you get to a point? I want to know a little bit about how you got to where you are in your career, how this Substack developed, and then also your focus on one of my favorite concepts right now is queering the boardroom, which you always call out in your newsletter, and give us an idea of like what names are rising to the top of boardrooms, who's joining, leaving what boards. So I want to know kind of your, like, give me your brief LinkedIn rundown.
Yeah, it's a little complex because I do many different things, but my journey is pretty straightforward, right? I was at the World Bank for 14 years and, and, and so, working on economic development, mostly in the global south. I had clients in Africa, then I had clients in Yemen, Egypt, and then Central Asia, Tunisia, Libya at the end. But then I was very interested in the well-being, the socio-economic well-being of LGBT people, which was a topic the bank was not as interested in as I was. And so, I started working more and more on the topic, and then eventually I left. And I moved to New York, actually, from DC to go work for the High Commissioner for Human Rights on LGBT issues. And then when I was working for him, I worked a lot on the standards of conduct that exist. They are part of the human rights framework for corporations on LGBT issue. And that's maybe the first time I really looked at the private sector, right? Because I'm a civil servant. And so I left the UN in 2020, right before the pandemic. And then I obtained my green card, which was a long process. And once I got my green card, I had a lot of freedom to do whatever I wanted. So I created a non-profit which exists, and I'm the executive director, which is an association of corporate directors. So LGBT people that are on board or want to be on corporate board. And then I created another non-profit a year and a half later with a group of former World Bank adjacent people. One of my co-founders is Lee Badgett, who created the Williams Institute and is an economist that works on LGBT issues. And so we do economic development, particularly focused on the global south. And then I also have a tiny bit of a consulting firm. And, I have one client, which is L'Oréal, the cosmetics company. And then I have a few other tasks. And I would say under that umbrella, I published a Substack, right? Which is, I always say it's the one thing that I take the most pleasure in doing every week, because I'm very interested in seeing how LGBT people fare. And then, to be frank, it's not a very serious Substack. It's a little self-indulgent. So, because I give my opinion on many things that sometimes I don't even have the expertise about, and so including, culture. Like I will mention what I'm reading, I will mention what I'm watching, and so, one of my friends said that the most self-indulgent thing I've ever seen, and I think I'm at peace with it. It is a pretty self-indulgent exercise, but what I love is that it allows me to be in touch with a few people. It's not a huge readership, but it's about 21,000 people. But then there are a few people that engage, which I love. When people write to you and they're like, I disagree, or they will comment, on the news and what's happening. And so, it's a huge source of joy. It's probably the one thing that gives me the most joy. And then besides that, I'm on the board of a bunch of nonprofits. I'm the treasurer of the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, which actually is being marked this weekend. I'm the chair of an institute, a geopolitical institute in DC called the Institute of Current World Affairs, which is 100 years old. I'm on the board of Housing Works, that works at the interconnection between homelessness and HIV and drugs in New York. So, I'm on the board of a TV, SUNY TV, the foundation of SUNY TV. So I have a few more non-profit engagement.
So when do you sleep?
When do I sleep? That's such a good question.
Yeah.
I'm going to be super straightforward with you. I have been single for a long time. I've been single since June 2022. And so as much as sometimes I feel it's, I would probably like to date a little more. It gives me a lot of space in my life,
Sure. Yeah, I get that. I made some notes of things in your Substack that have just really resonated with me that I kind of wanted to go through and to get you to expound upon further. There's something beautiful about your work and your point. It's so interesting that you described it as self-indulgent, because I actually find your work to be really ecological, in that it feels very much almost ministerial, in that I just feel I feel what you say so much that I want to go out and be a better, more active and vocal and reputable homosexual man, really. But I just sense like how much you want to impact the next generation through your lived experience in your work. And one of the things that you wrote about it on April 26th, that it was about a gay cousin of yours that had passed away, and how I think that there was a feeling of like that he failed his life because he didn't ever overcome whatever the trauma was. And it got you to speak to, but how do we live in a way that liberates those that came before us? And ancestral trauma, whether it be through bloodline or through society, is of really great interest to me, because I feel like we in the present have a great gift to be able to heal those that came before us. And I just wanted to see if you had anything else to offer on that concept of being impacted by your cousin's lived experience and how you operate.
That's interesting. Actually, he's from California. He lived in California. He was born in Switzerland, and he lived in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles when I was 20.
Beautiful.
And when I came out, the first thing I did is that I went to see him, because he was that cousin you would not talk about. He lived in the United States, and he was gay, and I have to be honest, he was not he had a lot of defaults, which in my 20s were a bit obvious. He lived way above his means. He was a bit materialistic. He was spending a lot of money. He was not making a lot of money, and he was a bit of a strange character, And he, as the year went by, unfortunately, he had Parkinson. He actually. He actually is an interesting character. He dated Nick Wilder, was a famous art dealer who died of AIDS. And so a lot of the people he had been with had died of AIDS, right? He was part of that Studio 54 crowd. And one of the last time at dinner with him, at that point, the disease was pretty advanced. He said to me, I think I failed my life. And I will always remember it. And, and I'm a bit of a self-centered gay man, right? So one of the things was like, I was still in my 40s, in my late 30s maybe, and I felt, well, what does it mean? Am I going to fail my life? And as time went by, as you saw maybe in the newsletter, unfortunately, he died kind of alone, and it took a while for people to find his body, which was a bit, the police was looking for a while, and they found his body, I think, 6 months later. And it really struck me, because as time went by, I realized that he really did what he could, right? In difficult circumstances, which is, it's difficult to plan your future if you don't really think you have a future, and if you see everybody around you dying. It's difficult to find balance, emotional balance, and to keep a job if you have internal turmoil that come from self-hatred, that comes from trauma, right? Like the trauma of seeing everybody die around you. It's also difficult to find community, right? If you felt at odds with your family, and if you left your community, like me, he left Europe, probably because it was easier to be gay far from home, right? And
Sure.
it's difficult because sometimes, I am faced with people that say, well, gay people are flawed. And sometimes society complains about us being flawed, right? But I have also a lot of empathy and compassion for who we are, And what's interesting is that, as you know, I work with LGBT people that are extremely successful. They have gotten to the top of business, right? And usually they have made huge sacrifice for it. And sometimes I can feel in them the same vulnerability I feel in myself, and the same vulnerability that my cousin experienced, which is, happiness, community, meaning. Those are very elusive for us. Like, we really have to get it. And, earlier you and I were talking about God, right? And finding spirituality in your life. For gay people to find spirituality, it means that you have to overcome gigantic hurdles, all the places of faith that are not welcoming to you. And also that strange feeling that, maybe you're not part of God's plan. And so I think, in that piece that you read, I talk about Larry Kramer, that always preface everything he said about gay people. He would always preface it by, I love gay people. I think gay people are great. And that's how I feel. I love gay people. And I think, LGBTQ plus people. I think LGBTQ plus people are great. And I think they also face gigantic hurdles. And I think we have to have high expectations for ourselves and for ourselves as a community. But we also have to always start with a compassion and empathy that being LGBTQ plus in this world, it's not easy. It's harder in some places, but it's not easy.
And it's why I believe you were just talking about how, for gay people for LGBTQ people to experience faith and spirituality, there's really, you have to overcome a lot. And that's why I believe that queer people are the greatest catalyst to the divine that exists, because we have to overcome and circumvent so much that's against us from day one. And it's even more difficult for people of color who have a different entrenchment in their particular denominations or religions. But I think that if religion is to be saved, it's going to be done through the voices of queer people. And it sounds like the grace that you have exhibited for your late cousin, I imagine, has healed their spirit, and other people are now impacted by that story. But it's why I think it's so important for us to keep being vocal and to keep standing out, especially in the face of an administration that wants to continue to quiet our voices, even though we have voices within this administration that are not using their platform to help LGBTQ people. I'm talking about Scott Bessent particularly. But, I just, when people talk about how, they don't want gay to be their identity, I just think that's such a privileged thing to say, because we don't have that luxury right now. Like, there are kids sitting in pews. There are kids who are listening to their parents listen to Fox News that are only getting one form of discourse, which is that their lives don't matter, do not have value. And it's so I what you're doing is helping hold space for that, and I hope that's what I do as well. So that story just really touched me. So I'm thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, I think sometimes you hear very different narratives of LGBT people that do not want to be part of that community. And the
Yeah,
narrative might be we have achieved our goals, Or the
yeah,
narrative might be I don't like the fact that gay people are always playing the victim card, right? Or
mhm,
the narrative might be, that's the least important thing about myself. And so, the response to that, of course, is to reiterate the fact that you don't have to agree with everything to form community, right? It's also to remind the fact that there is something strange about the LGBT experience, that, you might be right. It might be more than just about sexual orientation. It might be about the place we play in nature, or the place we play in biology, right? And then
yeah,
I would say the third aspect is to say that we are connected, right? That in a way, you cannot really disconnect your individual pursuit for happiness from our collective pursuit for happiness, right? And it means obligations and responsibilities, which sometimes is a difficult sell for people. They're like, I'm fine. I was born in a very welcoming family. I I've been doing very well. I don't even think about being gay. And so it's hard to tell to those people, well, you cannot really check out, that you don't really have that moral freedom of being like,
yeah.
you're right. The well-being of young LGBT people in very difficult contexts is none of my business. And, and I'm not saying that we all have to go on a big crusade for queer liberation. But I'm saying that, maybe we need to pause and to reflect and be like, okay, well, what is the LGBT community for me? And can I show up in small ways, particularly given the fact that the motor of liberation has stalled a little bit, right? And it looks like we are at a critical juncture.
Agreed. And you kind of touched on that this past week. You talked about the 2027 fiscal year budget that really seems to weaponize our community. And also, again, you spoke about it on the 10th with how there is a recasting of our aspiration for freedom as radical, as extremist, as terrorism adjacent, as a threat to national security. And so that the challenge is not only to defend our rights, but it's also to reclaim our narrative as a whole. To talk a little bit about what it's felt like being on the East Coast and being so close to politics, at least closer than I am, and having to see how our community, how the LGBTQ population is being targeted, weaponized, and exploited.
Well, look, I think there is always a little challenge in being in America, because America,
Hmm.
it ends up being very non-realistic, right? In which, the news from the United States feels so much more important than the news from abroad, that sometimes it's easy to forget that this is not an America problem, right? It's also a European
Hmm.
problem. It's also, it's also a Middle East problem, right? And it's a China problem. It's a Russia problem. LGBT people, like every minority that is challenging the status quo, that is bringing changes, particularly that is bringing changes in very key aspects of humankind, such as family, the relationship to the nation, the relationship to God, right? You're always at risk of being scapegoated, of being manipulated politically. So,
Hmm.
first of all, I don't really think it's an American problem, right? In fact, it's an LGBTQ plus problem, which is we have to find a way to extract ourselves from this situation, which gets in the way of our very legitimate goals, which is dignity, economic opportunity, having a relationship with a higher power, right? You know, those are very legitimate goals that every humankind more or less share. And what gets in the way is the fact that we get instrumentalized in politics, and also that sometimes we have difficulties finding our place in the family, in the community, and in the nation. And so, I think, when you're gay, the individual and the collective are very linked, which is there is a big part of me that is very focused on finding my own path to meaning, to
Sure.
community, to feeling, that my life makes sense. And then I think collectively, as a group, we are on a very new journey, right? It's less than 50-year old, in which we are like, okay, well, who are we? What are we allowed to dream for? And I think that's kind of interesting, right? That connection between the individual and the collective. When I wrote that piece this weekend about the fact that we went from being radical to extremist, and now it looks like we might be tagged as terrorists. And
Yeah.
and in a way, it feels a bit surrealistic because I have heard people close to me describe me as radical because I pushed issues like same-sex marriage, in France in 2013, or I felt, that surrogacy should be legal, right? And so it's interesting for me to think that people can, I never thought any of this was radical. I felt, all of this was a very legitimate request, the ability to get married, to love, the ability to form family. It never felt radical to me. So to
I know.
see those demands, being described as extremist, and particularly demands related to gender identity and gender expression, right? Being described as extremist and then even terrorist, it feels disconnected from our reality. And
Yeah.
and that's hard, right? Because how do we reconcile the fact that our quest is actually noble and legitimate, and the fact that it is described by people in places of power as being destructive and reckless, and also sometimes how do we manage our own self-doubt that, is it a legitimate quest? So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a strange time.
I laughed when I was reading it, when I saw the newsletter that day, because, I just thought, like, if they're calling, I made it personal. If they're calling me extremist, if they're calling me radical right now, you have no idea, because I can get crazy. I'm petty and I'm Southern. Like, I will get radical. I will get extreme. So I laughed at, like, there's an accusation of our community being radical and extremist now, but just you wait, Henry Higgins. You also talked about, this is where I want to get into, like, what impact or what can we do to make impact on the global stage. You wrote about Angel Maxine in Ghana, who's a trans activist there, and so that is. It's so foreign to us, literally and figuratively, in the worldview and lived experience of people who are going through, being LGBTQ, places like in Ghana. What can we do as first world gay men, as first world LGBTQ people, to help advance the cause of our community around the globe?
Yeah, sometimes I think about the fact that it's easy to caricature the world, right? When I was at the United Nations, I had this trick in which, people would come to visit me, and I was working in the secretariat, which is this very high building that is overlooking the river. And people would always say, well, what is the worst place to be gay? And I would always say it's across the river if you're born in the wrong family. Meaning
Mm.
that, the world is a complex place in which, Chinese homosexuals still have a life. They
Yeah.
they they go out, they fall in love, they live in relationships, they have tensions with their parents. Similarly, in Brunei, there is a Sharia law, but people are not really being lapidated in the street. In fact, there is an underground, somewhat
Hmm.
tolerated homosexual life, right? So the world is a very complex place. And what was a big surprise of my time at the World Bank, I was still a young man. I joined when I was 22, and I would travel throughout the world, and I would meet gay people everywhere that had life and that were kind of living in that context. Now, there are some contexts which becomes extremely difficult, particularly for working class people. And I would put Senegal as an example in that category. Lately we've been reading news about the result of this anti-homosexuality bill, which is that people are being chased, right? And they might be kicked out by their landlord. They are at risk of blackmail. And so some of those laws are really getting in the way of being able to have any form of life. And so we have a few instruments, that exist. Like, I was on the board of Outright Action International, which is called Outright International for a long time, that actually supports civil society movement, abroad and financially. We have seen also sometimes, in the case of Uganda, we have seen act of international solidarity in which, LGBT people abroad would find ways to support the local movement. I think the movement is severely underfunded today because, a lot of the funding was coming from Europe and the United States and particularly through USA, the State Department, the Netherlands, and a lot of this funding has dried up. So I think, it's important to continue to support the organizations that are doing the work. And then it's important that we build new institution, a new mechanism to support LGBT people everywhere, right? And if you think about other minorities, maybe LGBT people are the ones that are the least organized in, cross-border support. And we have some element of organization, but it's a little bit disparate. It's not very rich. As an example,
Why do you think that is, Fabrice? What do you think the disconnect is in keeping us from being as organized as we would like?
Well, I think there's several reasons, right? One reason is the fact that we are a pretty new movement. And, for the longest time, we didn't really have any financial means or any form of power, right? So the most we could have was civil society organization. There was no way we could have economic institutions or we could have, our, sophisticated mechanism of transnational solidarity. I think now we get to a point where there is a class of powerful, particularly gay men, right, in the West, that could build those institutions, could build those instruments, right? And so now one of the obstacles we have is the lack of transnational solidarity, which is, and that's something that's tied to what we discussed earlier, which is people not really understanding that the fate of the young lesbian in Tunisia is somewhat our responsibility, right? And then I would say the second element, which is maybe harder, is to develop a vision of what we could be, and particularly around what we discussed earlier, which is what are we? Are we a global diaspora? Do we have a role in society? What is that role in society? What would liberation look like? Getting married, having the right to be married, that's great. Being successful economically, that's great. Being able to worship, that's great. But that's not really a vision for a community, right? And, we spoke earlier about Jewish people, right? Jewish people have an overarching goal, which is to leave the world a better place, right? That's what the Jewish religion tells them, right? We don't really have that overarching goal. What is the goal of LGBT people? It cannot just be to be free. To be free for what, right? What is our role in society? How do we want to show up in the world? How do we want to be perceived? If today we are perceived as extremists, what do we want to be perceived as, right? Do we want to be perceived as like net contributor to society? And so, that's probably one of the missing pieces for us to do better, is to have an aspiration of where we want to go. And that has never really been articulated. And I love to tell people that it's not really our fault. In many ways, after Stonewall, we fought for survival. And during the AIDS epidemic, we fought for survival, right? We never really had the opportunity to fight for what we could be, rather than defining ourselves in opposition to the oppression we were experiencing.
Well, so Fabrice, for you, what is liberation?
I have a little joke that I say sometimes, if I speak at the association. I always say, that my French fellow, Christine Lagarde, was the head of the IMF, and now I think she's the head of the central bank. She said one day, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, we might have had different outcome. Meaning, maybe the 2008 financial crisis would have been different if there had been more women that had played a role in banking, right? And it's a quip. In fact, I don't know if Lehman Brothers was entirely male dominated. But I
Right.
always think we don't know what the world would look like if LGBT people would find their place in society. What if, as an example, we had a say in the wars that are happening right now? Whether it's the war between Israel and Lebanon, whether it's the war between
Sure.
Iran and the United States, you don't see gay people. Gay people are not in the room. They are not making decisions, right? Lesbian, trans people, they are never represented in any
Yeah.
of the decision-making bodies. Similarly, in business, I know because that's what I do. We have 0.9% of board seat on Fortune 500. So what it means is that
Say that again, please.
we have 0.9% of board seats on Fortune 500. So less than 1% of board seats, right?
0.9%.
So what it means is that it's hard to know what would the world look like if LGBT people had reached their potential and were contributing, right? And it's a question that is also legitimate for women. I recently I was looking at who were the big actors in the Iran-US war, and you have one woman at the European Union that doesn't have a lot of sway. And it's a bunch of men calling each other, straight guys, right, that are calling each other and deciding the fate of the world. So I think to me, that's a big question. What would the world look like if LGBT people were not just guests, but if we were part of the decision-making process?
It's interesting because, the elite gay men that are in the room right now, you look at Scott Bessent, you look at Sam Altman, you look at Tim Cook, and to me, they largely seem disappointing to me in that they're not doing enough for our community as a whole to exist and to hold space. But, I guess I need to have a little grace because they're also still responding to their own traumas as gay men, probably, and trying to fit in rather than like create the space. Are there any people, to put a positive spin on this, are there people that you watch where you just think like that person, that guy, that woman, that non-binary person, they are the one to watch? I'm ignorant, I guess, in the list of names of people that it could be. If I think about Pete Buttigieg, there's the trans.
The world has an entire army of LGBT people in places of power that feel a great allegiance to our community. So, you mentioned politics. We have a prime minister in the Netherlands that is extremely supportive of our community. And we had a prime minister in Ireland, very supportive of our community, is now involved with the Harvard Car Center on LGBT issues. We had a prime minister. We had a prime minister in France that is now running for president, Gabriel Attal, that recently published a book in which he spoke about the importance of his sexual orientation. I would say that in business, you can find a lot of LGBT people. You find LGBT people that are successful, that feel a sense of allegiance to our community. And then similarly in culture, there are a lot of LGBT people that do not forget, even though they have become very successful as actors or as performers, and they still feel a great sense of allegiance to our community. I would even say that in religion, even though it's more difficult, you have some LGBT people that now have power and that are still understanding the responsibility toward our community and are trying to use their position of power. Now, you give the case of some gay men in the United States that maybe have not been using their platform to the extent that they can, or have been using their platform in ways that are detrimental. What I believe is that we also have to ask ourselves what I said earlier, which is how can we make sure that we don't get to the top in a way that means we have nothing to do with LGBTQ plus people, and that we remain a sense of connection and, it's difficult because also I'll tell you something which is a bit anecdotal, but when I was working at the World Bank, when I would go in places where people had great suffering, as an example, when they had faced very authoritarian regime, they tended to be more individualistic. And that's normal, right? When you have been in a context where you have been oppressed, very often you think, how can I save myself? How can I save my family? And in a way, everybody else is on their own, right? So creating that sense that you're part of a community, that we are going to take care of you, that we take care of each other, and that we have rights and obligation towards each other, that is always intentional. It's not given. You know what I mean? we have to create community. We have to intentionally create those links in which we say, well, I make a commitment to you, you make a commitment to me, I'm going to be there for you. And you know what I mean? None of it is assumed. And sometimes I look at religious communities and I'm thinking very often the bond of religious community is around a belief in God, right? But our bond is also very strong. Our bond is based on an experience of alienation, an experience of loneliness and coming back to something. And I think, if we could articulate it, I think our bond could be as strong as the bond that comes from having a religious tradition. And so, of course, it's difficult to envision that, but I think that's something we have to work towards. And then people that will be in places of power will show up for their community.
That's so encouraging to hear. You're this is why I had you on, because you articulate things so beautifully and also very realistically, but there still is a lift to how you're describing things. With that said, where do you see our community in a post MAGA, in a post Trump world? Do you feel like, because I feel like right now there's a sense of feeling like we're in a 2 steps back situation. We've made some progress, but we've kind of, we're seeing some new major obstacles right now. Where do you see us in 10 years, our community?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, Americans are only 4% of our
Yeah.
entire community. If you put India and China together, that's
Yeah.
36%. So in a way, sometimes I look at China, which, is problematic at the moment, but, there might be a regime change at some point.
Sure.
I look at China as being much more determinant of where we'll go. And then India, India is a complex environment. I actually went there for the first time in 2012, and they decriminalized, and they recriminalized, and they decriminalized.
Uh-huh.
Now they have passed a very strange law on trans rights, which is undermining a lot of the self-determination of trans people. So it's a complex environment. But first of all, those environments are going to be the one that shape our trajectory much more than the United States. Now, I'll be very honest with you. I live in the United States. I live in New York. I want to become an American. America is a place I went to come out. I mean, because I felt I would be free here. So I have an emotional attachment to the American context. I think that the current period we are going through is probably not the end of the story. Things are going to change. I think in 10 years from now, we are probably going to be much more intentional and much more powerful. And the reason is because 2025, in my opinion, was a wake-up call. I always say that there is tremendous humiliation for me in seeing the rainbow crosswalk in front of Pearls being destroyed. There is tremendous humiliation in seeing the flag going down at Stonewall. There is tremendous humiliation in seeing the Harvey Milk warship being renamed, right? All of this, the message is, you have no power, you don't matter, I can do anything to you. What are you going to do? So what it means is that for me, that was a year where we realized how powerless we were, how at the mercy we were of shifting political winds, and how also we had made mistakes, including tying our future to the goodwill of Democrat politicians, right? I like Democrats. I have a lot of friends that are Democrats, but I do not think that Democrats and LGBT people are the same. You know what I mean?
Correct.
This is a political party. This is a political party that also is corrupted by money in many ways. And so LGBT people have no reason to be deeply in bed with a political party. And so what I suspect is that, it takes a while, but we are going to learn lessons about what happened to us, and we are going to build power, and we are going to build independence. And so in 10 years from now, we will be more powerful. We will be more able to achieve our objectives, and we will be less dependent on one specific group of powerful individuals.
Love that. That's such a good place to kind of wrap things up, Fabrice. What is, I don't know, what is something you wish you could have told yourself 10 years ago that you think would impact the community now to activate us, to get us to be more intentional? What is something you wish everyone could benefit from your own experience?
Well, to go back to the story of my cousins, it took me a while to understand that we have to start with compassion and empathy, right? That it's not easy to be LGBT. It's not easy to be LGBT for Scott Besson. No, it's not easy to be LGBT for most people. Like the journey is taxing, right? And so, as much as I made a lot of mistakes, so many, right? I talked about having children with someone I would eventually separate from, when they were 1 year and a half.
Mhm.
Sometimes I was a little bit intransigent in my beliefs around LGBT people. It took me a while to understand how you achieve progress, right? And at times I was also extremely individualistic, meaning centered on trying to build my own happiness, sometimes at the expense of others, right? And
Sure.
so I think, it's a long journey, but ultimately, I come back to what Larry Kramer said, which is I love gay people. Like we're good people. We're trying. It's not easy. We live in a world that is sometimes antagonistic, that has not been designed for us, where it's hard to understand exactly what we are meant to be, what we are meant to do. And so I think it's very important to start always with that compassion and empathy and be like, okay, well, little by little, I'm on the road to better myself. And I think that's what's happening to our community, that our community is on a road to better itself.
Wow. Well, then here is to progress and intention for our community. You were a big part of that to me personally, and I know to the other scores of thousands of people that subscribe to your newsletter. So, if the newsletter for you is self indulgent, my wish is that you keep being self indulgent because I indulge in your self indulgence. So. And thank you for being here. You were so wise, and I couldn't believe that you said yes to this because you're just so you exist in a world and like in a professional setting that is so foreign to me, but it's just been such a treat to get to talk to you. And you have
No,
to
I
let me
love
know if you
it.
come
And,
to
and
Palm
I have to say
Springs.
that the fact that this is you're also doing something around spirituality to me is very important because, that's the one dimension of my life that was the least developed for the longest time,
Sure.
right? And I think, maybe that's one of my regret, right? Is to not have understood that having had a complex relationship with religion did not mean I could not have a spiritual journey, right? And spirituality helps me live a lot, right? And
Yeah.
so I feel that that's probably one of the cruelest things that is done to LGBT people is kicking us out of places of faith because it's so much easier to live when you have, some spirituality. And so it's very harsh that, we very often
Yeah.
develop our spirituality outside of the usual places where people find it.
Yes. And in that, those places of spirituality also missed out on our gifts as LGBTQ people because we have skill sets and creative expressions that you do not find outside of our identities. And so I've always thought like, yes, did I miss out on some church opportunities because I felt kicked out? But it's not near as much as what you lost out on by getting rid of me. And that's why I think that queer people are going to be the ones that are going to save religion and faith because when queer people come back to that place of spirituality, they come with a fully fleshed out experience in this world to face the divine. And I don't know of anything that's more honest.
That's funny because last week I was in Paris and I ran to my friend Frédéric Martel, who wrote that book In the Closet of the Vatican. And so I
Uh
was
huh.
introducing him to some American I was with, and I said, "Well, look, he wrote that book," and I said, it's about the fact that everybody at the top of the Catholic Church is gay." And Frédéric Martel said, "No, not everybody, but we've been in the church for a
Yeah.
very long time.
Yeah.
In fact, most of the people of my generation thought for a moment maybe I should be a priest, but it comes back to what you discussed about LGBT people that are at the top of business, right? Which is if we cannot really be ourselves and if we are not tied to our community, then it doesn't mean much. And in fact, it can be
Yeah.
detrimental if we are at the top of society. And I think, that's a bit the story about the Catholic Church. Now, this being said, the progress that has happened in the Catholic Church lately is really impressive, and I tend, I had one day an amazing discussion with someone called Tiernan Brady, with a friend of mine, and he's the architect of the marriage equality referendum in Ireland and Australia. And he said to me, he said, "Look, Fabrice, what you don't understand is that the church is not a monolith." And he says, when the hierarchy might be very conservative, the parishioner, the head of parish, they might be doing a lot of
Yeah.
ministry toward LGBT people. And I will always remember that conversation because at the moment where my brain shifted a little bit from like having that angry thing of like the church hates me to no, like some places in the church were very aggressive against LGBT people, but there were a lot of priests that in their heart knew that, we needed to be taken care of and that we were children of God as much as the other parishioners. And so, it's always much more complex than it
Of
looks,
course.
right? And so, I always tell people, I say, I don't go to Catholic Church, but I could envision a future in which I would go back, and I
Yeah.
think it would be amazing to be able to come back and feel at home and feel that everything is forgiven. And, and it's hard to imagine that, but it might be in the future.
Yeah. Well, you're a part of that. I know you are. Your voice is so strong and wise. And so thank you again, Fabrice. It's been the biggest treat. You'll have to let me know if you're in California sometime, if you're going to end up retiring here. And I'll let you know when I'm in New York. Would love to buy you a coffee or something, okay?
Yeah, it was so nice talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and sorry if there were
Oh
some
my gosh.
technical difficulties.
Oh, please. That's always a good sign of things to come, in my opinion. So, and it was. So thank you so much again, Fabrice, okay?
I talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
That's it. And the people said, gay men, y'all come find us. We're at Fagnostic Pod on Instagram and TikTok and fagnostic.com. That's where the conversation keeps going between episodes. And if you want to find me personally, I'm at Hayes On It. The music you're hearing right now is an original composition by the incredibly talented Michael Spicer, who happens to be a friend of mine. We are so lucky to have his work as the sound of this show. So until next time, stay queerious, stay a little bit ungovernable, and I'll talk to you soon.